Good morning to you. One story dominates everything today and it's being watched around the world. It has arrived. The much-feared new variant of coronavirus, first reported in South Africa on Wednesday, is here. The implications are already serious for how we're going to live our lives this winter. But, and it's important to underline this, we know very little for sure. The government last night announced tougher rules on self-isolation, travel and masks, saying current vaccines offered only some protection. This leaves a host of obvious and urgent questions. On a jittery morning, we are here to help. Looking for answers, I'll be joined from London by Sajid Javid, the Health Secretary. From South Africa by the head of the country's medical association and the doctor who first spotted this new variant, Angelique Coetzee. From New Jersey by Dr. Paul Burton, the medical director of Moderna, already working on a new vaccine. And from here in Glasgow, in the midst of the SNP conference, by Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon. And there's some levity too. I've been talking to Tamsin Greig about playing a legend of the British theatre and her dark but funny new Christmas movie. Reviewing the news this morning, Catherine Salmond, editor of Scotland on Sunday, and Helen McArdle, the health editor of The Herald. But first, the news from Ben Thompson in Salford.
Thanks, Andrew. Good morning. Face coverings will become mandatory again in shops and on public transport in England to slow the spread of the new COVID-19 variant known as OMICRON. PCR tests for everyone entering the UK will also be reintroduced, and all contacts of new variant cases will have to self-isolate for 10 days, regardless of vaccination status. The new travel rules will apply to all international arrivals into the UK after 4 a.m. on Tuesday. 2 cases have now been confirmed in the UK, both linked to travel from Southern Africa. 61 people who arrived in Amsterdam on 2 flights from South Africa on Friday are infected with COVID-19 and have been placed into isolation. They were among 600 passengers who were held for several hours after arrival while they were tested for the virus. The Dutch health authorities are conducting further testing to see if any of them are carrying the recently discovered Omicron variant that is now classed as a variant of concern. Ministers from EU countries are due to meet in Calais today to discuss the migrant crisis in the Channel. UK officials are also expected to attend, but the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, was uninvited by the French after President Emmanuel Macron took offence to a public letter sent by Prime Minister Boris Johnson. 27 people lost their lives in the Channel last week, including 5 women and 2 children. Weather warnings remain in place across much of Scotland and northern England this morning as the effects of Storm Arwen continue to cause disruption. Rail passengers are being urged to check before they travel, with some services suspended or cancelled. 3 people are now known to have died after gale force winds brought down trees and damaged buildings. That's all the news from me for now. The next on BBC One is at 1 o'clock. Back to you, Andrew.
Thank you very much. Now, I did say there was only one story in this or any other town, and the newspaper front pages more or less show that. The Sunday Times has Christmas plans thrown into doubt as new COVID variant arrives in the UK. The Observer are very straightforward. PM imposes new curbs to fight Omicron as the first cases arrive. The Sunday Telegraph, the Prime Minister orders return to masks and isolation. The Sunday Mirror, mask up. Even you, Boris. Now, among the Scottish papers, we've got The Herald, has a slightly different story, but related, about the privatisation, it says, of Scotland's NHS. And Scotland on Sunday, it's the SNP conference, as I said, has another SNP figure saying it's not enough just to shout independence, 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 and a lot of coverage of the difficulties facing the SNP and its leadership at the moment. And that is all the result of the work of Catherine Salmond, editor of Scotland on Sunday, who is with me here, along with Helen McArdle, the health editor of The Herald, which we used to call, a long time ago, the Glasgow Herald, Helen. But it's The Herald now. Let's start by talking about the story, as I say, the only story in town, really, the new variant.
Yeah. So what we know is obviously new restrictions came in yesterday. Masks are now mandatory in England. They obviously have been in Scotland. We never lifted them. Stricter rules on travellers coming in. So from now on, if you're arriving, regardless of where you're arriving from, you need to have a PCR test and you need to self-isolate until you test negative. And also stricter rules on self-isolation as well if you are a close contact of someone who tests positive specifically for this new variant. And that would be for 10 days, and regardless of your vaccination status.
Helen, I guess the two questions that everybody's going to want to know the answers to, and we don't know the answers yet, are, one, is this going to make people more ill? Is it going to kill people eventually? And second, are the vaccines we've all got, or most of us have got, going to be any protection against it?
Yeah, the answer to both of those questions at the moment is that we don't really know for sure. There's certainly no evidence at the moment for sure that the new variant is more deadly or more dangerous, but simply just by being more transmissible, if it turns out to be, that is a problem in itself. We already saw that with Delta. If a variant is more transmissible, it will reach more people, unvaccinated and vaccinated. That, in the end, results in more people being in hospital. The other things, in terms of the vaccines, we know from the mutations on paper at the moment that a lot of the mutations on the new variant resemble the beta variant. That would suggest that vaccines are going to be less effective. Also, when you look at the spike protein, it's got 30 mutations specifically on that. That's double the number of Delta. The spike protein,
what's terrifying a lot of
the spike protein is what the vaccines are based on.
Yes.
So on paper, it doesn't look good. We can only hope that in reality, it doesn't turn out to be
more
quite
about
so bad,
all of that later on. Catherine, the Mail on Sunday in Scotland has another front page about the same thing, the crackdown and all the rest of it. But as Helen mentioned, the rules in Scotland are different and have been different for a long time, haven't they?
Yeah, this isn't going to affect us as much immediately. We've had face coverings here for a long time, as Helen says. So the biggest change here for Scots is the border controls, the PCR testing, the self-isolating. As the Scottish Mail on Sunday's going here, they're saying that tens of thousands of winter holidays will be affected because people from anywhere in the world are going to have to take these PCR tests. So that's the biggest change for Scots.
And there's going to be surge testing all across Scotland as well as in England. And of course, we don't know how many people are therefore going to have to self-isolate, because as I understand it, you're going to have to self-isolate if you've been in contact with the new variant. But how people are going to know that, I struggle to understand.
I'm not sure, but there is a piece I could just go to now in the Sunday Telegraph that's talking about that. They're basically highlighting the story here that's going on work in Essex and Nottingham. So under existing rules, people who've come into contact with somebody with this before haven't had to self-isolate, but they will do now. So you could have fully vaccinated people having to self-isolate for 10 days, regardless of if they've had their vaccination or not, which could affect, thousands and thousands of people. Big changes on that front.
And I think that'll just have to be down to genomic testing. Although, and we do a lot of genomic testing in the UK, but that's the only way that they would know if you had that variant.
And the Mail on Sunday asked another of the absolutely crucial questions. It says, is Omicron going to lead us into a new lockdown, Saj? Because it's got an interview with the Health Secretary. He'll be talking to us later on.
So, the message at the moment from the Health Secretary is no, not yet. So, not definitively ruled out, but it remains to be seen. The UK government seems to be sort of saying that they think that what they're doing at the moment will be enough. So, obviously, they're talking about, in terms of vaccines, the travel restrictions that we're talking about, the PCR testing, masks being brought back in England, and also genomic sequencing. They think that doing all those things combined might be enough to stave off the worst.
And the same interview has news of a potential new volunteer army inside the NHS.
Yes, to be honest, it does sound a little bit like the dad's army idea of NHS. They're calling it NHS reservists, modelled on the Army Reserve, made up of retired medics and logistics specialists who can swing into action if the NHS comes under strain in the winter. There already has been a lot of talk of trying to bring back retired medics. I think a lot of them are just exhausted. I'm not sure how many of them had any appetite to come back as it is. Yeah.
Catherine, one of the other really big issues here is if we go through, God forbid, another winter of partial lockdowns and masks and new restrictions, is how the public will react, because there is a very vocal, very passionate, albeit minority at the moment, who have had enough, who are sick to the back teeth of the whole thing. And if we have to go through another winter of this, that's just going to grow, isn't it?
I think that's the big talker at the moment, particularly on the approach to Christmas. Sunday Times have hit the nail on the head there. Science editor Ben Spencer is basically saying that compliance is going to depend on, firstly, the perceived scale of the threat and the clarity at which ministers actually present the request. And they've got some evidence here to suggest that if the public understands the rationale behind what they're being asked to do, they may comply.
So it's all about really good public education
and
public
the presentation.
Presentation, yeah. Well, we'll see what happens there. Let's turn to a Scotland-only story, as it were, which comes from your paper, Helen, about the privatisation of Scotland's NHS, because we hear a lot of criticism of the Conservatives for allegedly wanting to privatise the NHS, but of course the SNP is in charge in Scotland, and something parallel seems to be going on. Yeah,
so this is a story which talks about sort of £150 million contract by NHS National Services Scotland, which is essentially a quango of the Scottish Government, and they are, asking private health care firms to bid for about 1,500 procedures.
And some of these are quite complex.
So that's the thing. They're talking about various types of heart surgery, like heart bypass, cancer surgeries, bariatric surgery, brain surgery. So, complex procedures. And the thing is, it would not have been unusual before the pandemic for the NHS to refer patients to the private sector if it meant that they could get an operation more quickly. But it just seems from this that it's, number one, the scale of it. It speaks to the backlog we're coming up against. And also, just the complexity of the procedures that they're looking to do. I mean, on the one hand, for patients, I suppose, if you are facing maybe waiting 6 months, a year, more than a year for an operation, you might be glad to just go to the private sector and get an operation, because at least you're not waiting, and at least you're not having to pay for it out of your own pocket, which is something that we're increasingly seeing, this kind of two-tier idea where people are just, that can't afford it, go and get their operations, while those that can't afford it, after the pandemic, waiting longer and longer. So it's not necessarily a bad thing, but there could be, the pitfalls of relying on the private sector is that something goes wrong, that it still ends up going back to the NHS to carry the can, to deal with patients whose operations maybe don't go as successfully as thought. And it also does, to some extent, pull staff away from the NHS into the private sector, because we don't suddenly have loads more doctors just because we're using the private sector. So
Scotland is a different land, but not a different world, which brings me back to Scotland on Sunday, because it's the SNP conference, and you've got a lot of coverage at the front page of the book about the SNP and Nicola Sturgeon. Very interesting. Just tell us a little bit about all of that, because Nicola Sturgeon still bestrides the Scottish political scene, absolutely, and yet she has some really hard dilemmas coming up, doesn't she?
Yeah, she did. So her Deputy First Minister, John Swinney, spoke yesterday at the conference. Quite a lot of sort of criticism of his speech, that it was a bit samey, a bit predictable. He spoke about the need to sort of hang on in there to his, independent supporters. We'll get there in the end, just keep on going. He too said that he was very frustrated. So it leaves Sturgeon being criticised herself. We have Sir John Curtis, professor at Strathclyde University, saying that while the public is sympathetic and her supporters are sympathetic that the pandemic, the recovery from that has to come first, what is she doing to win over, vast majority of the country that she needs to get? So
presumably this new Omicron variant could delay things further in terms of a referendum.
It could. But at some point, as our headline says, it's not enough just to shout about independence. She's going to have to deliver on the specifics, particularly currency and oil.
And oil, of course, always oil. Catherine and Helen, thanks both very much indeed. That absolutely fascinating. And so to the weather. Wild storms yesterday and a light dusting of snow this morning in Glasgow. It's beginning to feel a bit like Christmas, but I hope it's going to get quieter. What next? Over to Ben Rich in the Weather Centre. Ben.
Yes. Thank you, Andrew. Hello, good morning to you. Certainly a quieter end to the weekend after that very stormy and turbulent weather we had yesterday. Today, a much calmer affair. But as you mentioned, there is a little bit of snow around in places, still some wintry showers in the forecast, despite some bright weather it stays cold for the time being as well. So those wintry showers continue across eastern coasts of England. An area of rain, sleet and snow moving out of southern Scotland into northwest England, Wales and the Midlands. Could be some snow even to quite low levels here. But elsewhere, some good spells of sunshine. Still quite breezy for some, particularly close to this east coast, but not nearly as windy as it was yesterday. Still cold, though. Top temperatures between 2 and 8 degrees. And most of us will again see a frost tonight. Temperatures down as low as -5 or -6 for a few. Still some of those wintry showers for eastern England. And then this band of cloud and rain moving into Northern Ireland, western Scotland. Some snow on the leading edge. But with that band of cloud and rain, notice some milder air starting to work in Stornoway, Belfast, starting tomorrow above freezing. That's a sign of things to come. Our band of cloud and rain, and it will mostly be rain, sinks further southwards and eastwards during tomorrow. Milder air with it. Glasgow, Belfast, 10 degrees. Stays cold in the east for Monday. It'll be milder for all of us on Tuesday. Andrew.
Many thanks. Now, around the world, scientists are poring over every single scrap of new data about the variant causing such concern. Earlier this morning, I spoke to two people on the front line of that research. Dr. Paul Burton, the medical director of the vaccine maker Moderna, who, as he told me, is already working on a new booster for Omicron. But first, to Dr. Angelique Coetzee, chair of the South African Medical Association, and the doctor who spotted this first.
What happened is around about the 18th of November, I all of a sudden encountered unusual symptoms with actually started with a male patient that's around about the age of 31 roundabout, and never, very seldom visits the surgery. And he said to me, he's just extremely tired for the past 2 days. And he's got this body aches and pain with a bit of a headache. Not really a sore throat, more a scratchy type of description, and no cough and no loss of smell or taste. And because it's unusual for that specific person to present with this type of symptoms, I decided to test. We do rapid testing in our surgeries, and I did the rapid test and it was positive. I then tested the rest of his family and it's all positive. Every one of them very, very mild symptoms, and that is what we call mild symptoms. And then for the rest of the day, I actually saw more patients coming in with the same sort of symptoms. They all tested positive. I alerted the advisory committee of the minister on the vaccines because I'm part of that committee, and that's why it's easy for me to say to them, listen, something is wrong. I have seen today a picture that doesn't fit in with Delta. And then the beginning of this past week, it came out that this is the new variant going around. What we are seeing clinically in South Africa, and remember, I'm at the epicenter, that's where I'm practicing, is extremely mild. For us, that's mild cases. We haven't admitted anyone. I spoke to other colleagues of mine, the same picture.
So do you think that we, in Britain, in the United States, in Israel, in Europe, do you think we're all panicking unnecessarily?
I think you already have it there in your country. You're not even knowing it. And I would say, yes, at this stage, I would say definitely. 2 weeks from now on, maybe we will say something different.
You suggested just a moment ago that it may be seeded in the UK already some way back, and we may simply not have noticed.
Yes. Definitely, because you are seeing a lot of Delta cases. Remember, we had a break. We had about 8 to 10 weeks break between our last wave and this new variant coming onto the market now. And so for us to easily see this, to see there's something different is easy. Your doctors might be more focused on the Delta symptoms and missing this, because it's easy to miss this. If it wasn't for the fact that we had not seen really COVID cases this past few weeks, we would have also missed it.
And that was very, very interesting. Dr. Angelique Coetzee, thank you so much for talking to us. Now, in America, work has already started on a new booster vaccine for Omicron, and it's being led by Dr. Paul Burton, who's the medical director of Moderna, and he joins me now from New Jersey. Paul, welcome. Can I start by asking you what you know now about this new variant, Omicron?
I think, Andrew, to be honest, at the minute, we're still really trying to work out what is going on with this variant. I would say there's 3 very important questions. The first is it more transmissible? The second is just how severe will the disease be that it can cause. And the third is, will we be able to neutralize it and control it and contain it with the current vaccines? I think the answer to that third question we should know in a couple of weeks from laboratory experiments, but is it more transmissible and is it more severe? That's going to take a little longer for us to work out.
But your suspicion, looking at what you know about it at the moment, is that it will escape the current vaccines?
Yes, these mutations, at least 30 of them in the spike protein alone, 9 of them known to be associated with immune escape, another 11 predicted to be associated with immune escape. You bring those together, I think this is a very concerning virus.
So do you think that means at the moment, if we're double or triple vaccinated, we've got no protection or we've got some protection?
Well, that's a good question. I think it depends a little bit on how far out you are from either your initial vaccination or having had a booster. We'll have to get the laboratory results, which, as I say, should be in a couple of weeks. We've been able to test a high-dose booster of the Moderna vaccine at 100 micrograms and a lower dose, a 50 microgram booster. So I think we should get some information from that. How effective are the boosting shots?
Paul, you mentioned a little while ago the unknown when it comes to severe disease. Basically, how ill will this make us? Now, we're being encouraged not to be too worried by people from South Africa who say the symptoms so far are relatively mild. But I guess the problem there is that in South Africa, the population is very young. There are relatively few older and more vulnerable people to be infected.
Yes, I think that's right, Andrew. I think we have cause to be hopeful. We've learned a lot about this virus in general. We've learned so much about how to deal with COVID as well, through simple measures and obviously through vaccines. But until we see how this virus now behaves in populations of older people, people with other comorbidities, we really will not get a handle on exactly how severe the disease could be, I think.
Now, Paul, you're already working on a booster against Omicron, which is quite remarkable. Can I ask when you started to work on this and what your timeline is for it?
Yes, so it's been the Thanksgiving holiday here in the United States, and we're a US-based company. We've mobilized hundreds of people here in the US and around the world. We started that really early on Thursday, on Thanksgiving Day. We should know about the ability of the current vaccine to provide protection in the next couple of weeks. But the remarkable thing about the mRNA vaccines, the Moderna platform, is that we can move very fast.
Lots of people will be imagining you and your colleagues putting the Thanksgiving turkey to one side, going back to work at short notice to do this, and then will be asking themselves, OK, if we need it, when will we get the new Omicron vaccine from Moderna into our arms? How soon might it be available?
If we have to make a brand new vaccine, I think that's going to be early 2022 before that's really going to be available in large quantities.
Finally, we heard from Dr. Coetzee in South Africa, who said that we should not be too alarmed about this new variant. What's your own personal view?
Look, I think, we've learned so much about the coronavirus and COVID over the last 2 years. We have very effective vaccines. I think the message now is if people are on the fence and you haven't been vaccinated, get vaccinated. If you're eligible, and I believe in the UK, over 40-year-olds are eligible for one of the vaccines and you can mix the boosters as well, get boosted. I think we have some experiments that need to get done. This is a dangerous-looking virus, but I think we have many tools in our armamentarium now to be able to fight it. So I'm optimistic.
All right. Paul, you've stayed up very late to talk to us. Thank you very much indeed for doing that. Thanks.
Thank you.
And the Health Secretary, Sajid Javid, joins me now from London. Welcome, Mr. Javid.
Good morning.
Are there any more cases of the new variant confirmed overnight?
No more confirmed cases at this point that I'm aware of. And I think you're looking at this is that we can look back at the summer and feel that we made the right decisions. We made the right decisions with our world-leading booster program. But I think everyone wants us to protect the progress that we have made, and that is why we have acted very swiftly and I believe in a proportionate way with the news of this new variant. And that includes the decision on Thursday to red list 6 countries at that time. We added 4 more countries to that list yesterday. So anyone arriving from those countries now will have to isolate in hotels. And then also the measures that we set out yesterday. And the strategy of all of this is to buy time for our world-leading scientists to assess this variant and to learn more, because there's a lot we don't know, and also to take these mitigating actions.
OK, Dr. Kurtzy, who discovered this new variant in South Africa, she says that it's almost certainly around the UK more widely, but we just haven't picked it up because it's so much like one of the earlier variants.
Well, look, she may well be right, as in there may well be more cases, and that is why when we confirmed these 2 cases yesterday, one in Essex and one in Nottingham, we immediately went about making sure we have properly traced all their contacts, and also we're doing targeted testing in both of those areas, and then sequencing of all positive tests.
When will people know whether the current vaccines are effective against this new variant?
Well, thanks for asking me about that, Andrew, because the vaccines, first of all, they still remain our first line of defence.
But do they work?
Well, it's a fair question, and I just heard earlier from the interview you had with the gentleman from Moderna, is that, I mean, the truth is we don't know enough about this variant yet, and that is why we need the time to assess it. We will know more, I think, in 2 or 3 weeks, a lot more. But there's every reason to believe that the vaccines remain effective. And even if, by the way, the variant impacts that effectiveness in a negative way, there will still be a real purpose to getting vaccinated than not being vaccinated at all. And that is why I've also, I asked, as soon as I learned about this variant, I asked the JCVI, that's our group of expert advisors on the vaccine, to give me urgent advice on broadening the booster programme. I've also asked the NHS to prepare for a much greater capacity in our vaccination programme.
As Health Secretary, do you now think it's time to start vaccinating 12-year-olds?
Look, I mean, when it comes to vaccines, I think it's right that we get expert advice, and that's what I do, to listen to the views of our advisors at the JCVI.
You've asked them for it urgently. When do you think you're going to get that advice?
Imminently. I would say in the next day or so. Yes. And I think they absolutely understand the urgency of this. And I do want to see if we can, subject to the advice, really broaden the vaccination programme. And that is why you're getting the excellent work the NHS has already done on this, and seeing how we can expand that even further.
Well, that gentleman from Moderna you quoted just now also says that they think they will have a booster ready by early next year. If that's true, and if the other companies are saying the same kind of thing, will you be ready to actually roll it out then?
Well, we work very closely with all the major vaccine companies, including Moderna. We already obviously have many Moderna vaccines, but in terms of any developments in those vaccines, we'll obviously be working really closely with those companies. And should we need to procure more vaccines and things, of course, we won't hesitate to do that.
Have you received any advice so far about why this new variant is so much more transmissible? Is it transmitting through the air, for instance? That's one story that we've heard.
Well, I think from what we know, we have shared that information. We were the first country in the world to identify this new variant as a potential threat. That was earlier last week. And as I say, we acted swiftly. We were the first country in the world to make the travel restrictions, and many others have followed. But in terms of the impact of the variant itself, as you've just heard from your previous contributor, there's reason to believe, because of the mutations that have been observed from, let's say, what's called a desktop analysis, that it may be more infectious, it may make the vaccines less effective, and it does have some characteristics of vaccine escape. Now, at this point, I think it's important to remain sort of cautious, of course, but to learn much more about this, and that's why I think these actions we've taken are important to buy that time so we can assess it more.
What's not theoretical, because it's been observed, is that this has different symptoms from earlier versions of coronavirus. In other words, the taste and smell problem isn't there, but extreme fatigue is there. Are you going to update advice to the public about what to look for?
We will, of course, if we need to, Andrew, but I think just at this stage, we just don't know enough about it to start doing that immediately. And I think people can see just how swiftly we have acted. We won't hesitate to make updates of that type if we need to. And of course, we'll work in collaboration with our international partners. And in that, can I just say, I know you had someone from South Africa on earlier. I think South Africa has acted in the most exemplary way. Its scientists have done everything that you would expect of expert scientists and responsible scientists in reporting this and working with us and others, and they are really, truly to be commended for that.
Let me ask you now about some of the measures that you're bringing in response to this. First of all, if, God forbid, this gets out of control and is very, very infectious in this country, will you bring in further regulations? Will you bring in a return to at least some form of lockdown, self-isolation, working from home? Are those still on the table?
Well, I mean, first I'd say the measures that we have taken so far that we announced on Thursday and yesterday, I think these are the right sort of proportionate, is the right sort of balanced response to the threat we see at this point in time. And they are important measures, so requiring...
Let me ask you specifically about them, if I may.
Yes.
So you're making mask wearing in England compulsory on public transport, but not in hospitality. Why is that?
Because when it comes to making decisions like this, and let's think about mask wearing specifically, since you asked about it, there's obviously a sort of a spectrum of action we could have taken on masks, but we wanted to do it in a targeted way. The advice was that this was the best way to do it with shops and public transport, and that's what we've done. And I think that's an appropriate response. But as you know,
I'm sorry to interrupt, but just to be absolutely clear, this is a new rule which is in place now. And people who don't obey that, people who go into shops without masks, can be fined, will be fined.
Well, what has changed, I think, with this announcement is that I think the British public can see that why the government has announced this, and they have, I think, throughout the pandemic, always acted in a responsible way,
I'm just asking
listening to the latest information.
I'm just asking a very straight question about what your actual proposal now is. Are you insisting, as a government, that everybody going into a shop wears a mask? And are you going to take sanctions on people who refuse to?
Yes, it will be a legal requirement by government regulation to wear masks in shops and public transport.
Let's move on to the travel restriction area, because that doesn't come in until 4 a.m. on Tuesday. By then, thousands more people will have arrived by plane into the UK. Why did you delay it?
Well, first thing is there's two parts to the travel restrictions. The first part, which is the red listing, that's come into place today. It's effective already, and that's from 10 countries. The bit that you're talking about, which is the requirement for all international travellers to self-isolate until they get a negative PCR test result, that will come in as soon as possible. The timing on that is that we have always, and I think rightly, taken a four-nation UK-wide approach when it comes to border measures, and we're working with our colleagues across the four nations to bring it in as soon as possible.
You are going to bolt the stable door, but the horse may already be out there. There were several big flights came in from South Africa on Friday, and 2 flights came into the Netherlands from South Africa on Friday, 600 people on board, and of those 600, 61 had coronavirus, and the Dutch are saying almost certainly the new variant. So that's 10%. How many of the people coming into the UK on those flights had coronavirus?
Well, Andrew, I think it's fair to say we could not, as the UK, we could not have acted more swiftly. We identified this variant as a potential threat and shared that with the world. We red-listed countries and took the action against the epicenter of this at the moment, which is Southern Africa, on Thursday, practically within hours of learning about the threat. No other country had done that. We were the first in the world. And then the following day, we acted when we found 2 cases in the UK.
Did you test people on those flights as they came into the UK or not?
All people coming from Southern Africa before the red list was a legal requirement, first of all, they have all been contacted, not just all of them, but all of those that have arrived in the last 10 days prior to that, and they have all been asked to take tests and to isolate, of course, if they are positive.
How did they get home from the airport?
Well, they would have got home in the normal way, but really the speed at which we worked, it is just not possible to go any faster than that. And I think
to be clear, you didn't test them as they came into Heathrow. and then they were allowed to disperse around the country without being tested. And if the Dutch experience is anything to go by, 10% of them had the new variant of coronavirus.
Well, let's... I don't want to jump to conclusion around the Dutch experience. I think there's still a lot that we don't know about what is happening and what is happening certainly in other countries. What we do know is much more about our own country, and I think the speed at which we acted at, it could not have been any faster. And in terms of those people that may have already arrived from Southern Africa before the rules change, I think the appropriate and right thing to do was to contact them all and make sure that they are taking tests and self-isolating if necessary. And that is exactly what we have done.
Well, you mentioned self-isolation. That is a big new change as well. One thing I genuinely don't understand is you only have to self-isolate if you've been in contact with somebody who's got the new variant of coronavirus. How can you possibly tell?
Because this one of the features of this new variant is when you take a PCR test, it's called the S gene dropout. It's basically a feature of this particular variant. It has been there with Beta and other variants, but it is not there with Delta. The Delta variant, as you will know, is the absolute dominant variant in the UK. It's like 99.9% of cases. So what we can quite easily test for is for the S gene dropout, and that is a very good proxy for this, and that is that is why we said suspected cases of this new variant.
So the answer to my question is you will be contacted by Public Health England if you've been in contact with somebody with the new variant. How long is that going to take to get that information back?
Well, it'll be very, very, very fast, actually, because what happens is, as you know, everyone will be required to take that PCR test, whether they're travelling or whether it's for domestic purposes. The labs, both the government labs and other private labs, they will all be required to do the S gene dropout test on every test, and that result would come very, very swiftly.
If this spreads very fast, which it might, then lots and lots of people may have to self-isolate suddenly. Will there be exemptions for instance, NHS workers and lorry drivers and other critical groups?
No, I don't think, Andrew, at this point we can jump that far ahead. I think we have to take this at a stage at a time and take the responsible mitigating measures. Of course, we keep this under review, and that is why the Prime Minister rightly said we hope these are all, there will be temporary measures, but in 3 weeks' time we will have a review point and we will see where we are then. But at that point, the difference will be we would have learnt a lot more about this variant. But also in that time, it's really vital, this is that we will be able to vaccinate a lot more people. I want to make an even broader offer of vaccines, especially the boosters. Last week when I was on your show, I think I was saying we were at about 30% of people in the UK, or lower than that. Now it's about 36% all over the age of 12. We've done another 2 million boosts since I was on your program last week. If you get me on again next week, I thought we would have done millions more. But the important is we've got to get people to come forward if they're eligible and take that booster shot. The reason we are seeing hospitalizations fall over recent weeks is because of the booster program, the most successful in the world, second only to the United States. It's working, and we need people to come forward.
Do you think people should work from home where possible?
No, I don't think that's necessary.
Why not?
Because this is about taking proportionate action against the risks that we face. And I think what we have set out yesterday and a couple of days before that on the red listing, these are the appropriate, responsible things to do.
The reason I ask about that is SAGE, your advisors, are very, very clear. They say reintroduction of working from home guidance is likely to have the greatest individual impact on transmission out of the proposed measures, and yet you've ruled it out.
Well, I think our scientific advisors, whether they're SAGE or others, that's their job. They give advice. Ministers need to decide. And one thing, by the way, ministers need to
ignore it. I mean...
Well, our job is to take account of any scientific advice and then decide. And let's remember, in the past when we've taken such actions, they also come with a really heavy cost on the economy, on people's social lives, on their mental health. And I've seen so many problems in the NHS that were non-COVID problems, caused by previous lockdowns and things. So, that's not of interest to me.
It's a jittery morning, let's be honest. What kind of Christmas are we looking forward to?
Well, look, the reason we've set out these measures yesterday, a couple of days before that, is to protect the progress that we've made so that we can all continue to look forward to Christmas with our family and friends. I certainly am, and I think in a few weeks' time when we have that review point, we'll know a lot more about this variant. But this government, I think what we've shown throughout this pandemic, but especially now over the last few days, is the role we play internationally in trying to combat COVID, but also that we won't hesitate to take swift action and in a proportionate way whenever necessary.
Sajid Javid, Health Secretary, so much more we could talk about, but thanks very much indeed for joining us this morning. Now then, from the golden era of the 1950s right up until her demise in the 1990s, one woman was at the very heart of British theatre. Margaret Ramsay, or Peggy as she was known to her famous clients, was a legendary agent and a very complex figure. Tamsin Greig is about to play Peggy in all her contradictions on stage in London, and I caught up with her this week during rehearsals at the Hampstead Theatre.
Have you made the coffee?
The kettle's boiled, but the phone keeps ringing.
Oh, anybody interesting?
Both the Yorkshire Allens.
Yorkshire, that's in the north. We have an Allen in Grimsby.
In Hull.
And another in Middlesbrough.
Scarborough.
Why are they telephoning all of a sudden? They both hate the telephone.
Money.
All my clients telephone about money, very rarely about anything else, and never, under any circumstances, to ask, what is a play? Peggy Ramsay was the foremost play agent of her time from the 50s up to the 80s, and she found and nurtured the great playwrights of the time. So she looked after people like Joe Wharton, David Hare, Willie Russell, Christopher Hampton, all the big names, and basically created the theatre industry.
This is the beginning of a career, isn't it?
The play, which was written by Alan Plater, who was one of her clients, who was with her for, I think, 30 years. This is a sort of love song to her after she died, and it's very witty and has these beautiful, this kind of cowardesque kind of rhythms to it.
I think I can now come out and say that I've read it, and I find it one of the funniest things I've read for a very, very long time. And a great part for you, this very important, feisty female figure in what was still then a very, very male world. And yet, proto-feminists coming to look at this, hoping that she's one of them, will be rudely surprised, not only by the feminist movement, but by her admiration for Margaret Thatcher.
Yeah, she really enjoyed the company of men and found women not so much difficult or complicated, but too known. There's a famous interview that she did with Carol Churchill where she's trying to persuade Carol Churchill that women have nothing new to tell her because she's a woman, and Carol Churchill trying to persuade her that she has everything to tell her. And then she told Carol Churchill that maybe she should try writing children's stories. I mean, that's one of the greatest female playwrights of our time. So, you know, she was complicated, she was complex.
If I was chosen a very good woman writer and a very good male writer, I would choose a male writer. Because it's... I learn things, and I don't learn an awful lot from women writers that you don't already know.
And of all the people that she really discovered and brought onto the stage for the first time, I guess Joe Wharton is probably the most important. Yeah,
Joe Wharton was this working-class lad from Leicester, and she would fall in love with these new playwrights. It was the discovery of the new, and new writing was her passion. She was utterly passionate about what people had to say, about where they were at. And so she did nurture Joe Wharton, and then was, I think, one of the first people in, when he was murdered by his lover, Ken Halliwell, to identify the body. And when she sees him, she's just very interested in the fact that there is an axe in his head, and very quickly is able to sort of step over the body, and then said afterwards that she thought that, that Joe Wharton would have found it incredibly interesting that he had been murdered by his lover.
The kind of thing that you're not supposed to say, but she said all the time. And at one point she says, living requires more courage than suicide.
Yeah. And also she says, we all fail. The question is whether we do it with courage. Oh, do we have the courage to fail? And I wonder whether that may be our problem at the moment, is that we're just too afraid to fail.
It's a good question for all of us. What's not going to fail, I'm sure, is your Christmas outing as the evil, evil Mrs. Wickens. Tell us about Mrs. Wickens.
Mrs. Wickens is in a piece adapted by Mark Gatiss, from the film The Amazing Mr. Blunden, which is a film from the 1970s.
This is the famously cuddly Mark Gatiss.
Yeah, who's actually quite dark and frightening. And he and I play Mr. and Mrs. Wickens, who are basically child killers. So it's a film for Christmas Eve to terrify the children.
Waste of a nice room, if you ask me. What use has books ever been to a body, eh?
Exactly.
Never done me any good.
Mind you, you can't read.
Exactly. Good for nothing but kindling. Hey, husband.
Pretty, pretty.
But just a nice little conflagration, eh? Enough to make it look accidental, like.
You're utterly terrifying.
Apparently I am. I haven't seen it, but people who've seen it are that, you know, there's no let-off. She's just wicked. And at the heart of it, there is the amazing Mr. Blunden, played by Simon Callow, who is the ghost from the past who comes back to redeem himself. And so it's a story of redemption out of wickedness.
So you've run the gamut from humour to horror. Tamsin Greig, thanks very much indeed for talking to us.
Tamsin Greig there. And the play Peggy for You opens at London's Hampstead Theatre on the 10th of December and runs until the end of January. And I'm joined now in Glasgow by the First Minister of Scotland and leader of the SNP, Nicola Sturgeon. Welcome, Nicola Sturgeon. Let's start by talking about Omicron, this new variant. Are there any cases in Scotland yet that you know of?
There are no cases identified in Scotland yet that I know of. Clearly, that is a moving picture. We have stepped up surveillance. We're monitoring this very, very carefully. I hope we don't identify cases in Scotland, but I think we should assume that we will, and therefore I'm asking people to behave right now as if this new variant is present in Scotland, comply with all of the mitigations and protections that are currently in place, you know, pick up our compliance, and that will help us, if it is here, slow down any risk of transmission.
To try and avoid it coming, it may be inevitable that it comes here, but to try and avoid it, you're taking the same kind of measures as the UK government in terms of people flying into Scotland. But they're introducing the new checks from Tuesday at 4 a.m, which means that lots of people will come in before the checks are there. Are you going to do it earlier here?
We're seeking to do it as quickly as possible. It's important to get a proportionate response to this. I think we may have to go further on restricting travel in the days to come. I hope I'm wrong about that, but we must keep our minds open to that.
Would you close the border with England if necessary?
Look, that's a question I've been asked repeatedly, possibly including by you, over the past 2 years. It's very difficult. You know as well as I do the nature of the border between Scotland and England and the nature of the flows across the border. We will do everything we can. We have at times in the pandemic previously advised against travel across the England-Scotland border. That's always a last resort. I think we need to be open-minded to doing anything required to keep the population safe right now. And, you know, while we're all worried about this, I'm certainly very concerned about the most recent developments around this. On the upside, we know all of the things that we can do to slow down the transmission of this virus, whatever variant we happen to be talking about. So it is about wearing face coverings, hygiene, it's about making sure you're vaccinated, even if, and it is an if at this stage, it turns out that this variant is evading the virus, to the vaccines to some extent, and the vaccines are less effective. That doesn't mean they are not still effective at all. You will still get protection from being vaccinated. And, of course, test yourself regularly, which is something we're asking people to do whenever they mix with others at the moment.
Talking about the possible measures, what about making home working compulsory?
Look, we keep everything under review. So in Scotland right now, it is, well, everything's possible. That doesn't mean that these things are necessarily going to happen. All along, I've tried to avoid saying to people we can, you know, absolutely rule this out or rule that out. We are still living with a very infectious virus. We may have found again that it is just picked up its speed of transmission. So we've got to be flexible in the face of that. But can I finish the point? In Scotland, we are already advising people to work at home wherever that is practical and possible. So our advice on that hasn't changed in Scotland in the way that it has in recent months in England.
What about stopping people mingling indoors if you know, God forbid, this new variant is as transmissible as it appears to be?
Look, I'm sitting here, Andrew, with every fibre of my being, hoping that none of these things are necessary. None of us want to go back. You know, we've lived with this now for almost 2 years. We are all sick and tired of it. I heard a clip from the programme earlier on where you were saying a minority of people are really sick and tired of this. Actually, I think the majority of us are sick and tired of this.
A minority are doing something about it,
have always been less willing to comply. I think a majority, although we're sick and tired of this, understand that we need to do certain things to keep us as safe as possible from this virus. I'm not going to sit here 48 hours on from the detection of a variant of this virus that may be even faster transmitting than Delta, and Delta was faster transmitting than anything that came before, that may escape vaccines to some extent, and I'm not going to sit and rule anything out, but that does not mean to say that I want to be in a position of imposing these kinds of protections again. None of us want to be in that position.
Listen, I know this is a very fast-moving situation. I'm not trying to be silly about it, but at this point, you're not really doing anything different than you were doing before, and you're not doing much different than Boris Johnson is doing down in London, the man you've criticised quite a lot.
It's not a political competition. I've said all along that my first and most important duty is to do what I judge to be correct and appropriate and proportionate to keep people in Scotland safe. So we already, Boris Johnson last night, and I think he was right to do this, reintroduced the requirement in certain settings to wear face coverings. We've always had that requirement in place in Scotland.
Sure.
So face coverings in shops, on public transport and in Scotland in hospitality settings when you're moving around. So we've got that in place. We've got a heavier advice and guidance on home working already. Now, what I would say, we have taken steps around travel. If we do identify cases in Scotland, then we will ask any close contacts of those cases to isolate for 10 days. But if every one of us just picks up our compliance with the mitigations already in place, then that's going to make a difference. Will it be enough of a difference? We will only be able to know that when we learn more about this virus, this variant of the virus, in the days to come. But we can all act now. We've all got agency against this virus. That's been the case since day one, and it's important right now, really important, that we use that to full effect.
You've talked about vaccine. One thing that comes up again and again in these conversations is the idea of vaccine passports. But presumably, if this new variant isn't, if vaccines are not so effective against this new variant, then vaccine passports are even more useless than they were before.
Well, I don't think they're useless. We have vaccine passports in place, or COVID certification in place in certain settings in Scotland. That's the case in Wales, I think, from tomorrow. It's about to be the case in Northern Ireland as well. I think it's really important, Andrew, and I want to make this point very clearly. And I know you're questioning me, so it's not criticising the line of questioning. We've got to be careful about binary presentations of these things. If, and let me stress, it is an if because we don't know yet, but if vaccines are less effective against this variant of the virus, that is not the same as saying that the vaccines are not effective at all. It is still going to be the case that vaccines have a high degree of effectiveness, and you will be more protected and you will protect others more if you are vaccinated than would be the case if you're not vaccinated. So my message, we've got very, very high uptake rates in Scotland, as is the case across the UK for these vaccines. But my message right now is that if you are eligible to be vaccinated and you are not yet vaccinated, please get vaccinated, because the failure to do so is putting your own life at risk and it's putting the lives of other people at risk. And if that was true this time last week, that is even more true potentially right now. So please do get vaccinated and make sure you get your flu vaccine if eligible too.
And it has big consequences for the NHS in Scotland, which is going to face a really tough winter. Can I ask you why, according to the Royal College of Emergency Medicine, more than 300 people have died this year as a direct result of long waits in Scottish A&E departments?
If it's the Royal College of Emergency Medicine study that I think it is, and it may not be, maybe another one, then it's an extrapolation based on a UK-wide study. But waiting times for treatment in accident and emergency units in Scotland, as is the case across the UK, are longer than anybody would want them to be right now. The waiting times for treatment more generally, because of the impact of the pandemic, because of the backlog created, are longer than any of us want them to be. That's why we have an NHS recovery plan in place. We're targeting a 20% increase in NHS resources over this Parliament. We have our budget on the 9th of December, which will make a
300
significant...
extra deaths because of these...
an extrapolation, but if people are waiting longer than they should be in accident emergency, I'm not going to sit here and say that that doesn't create risks for patients. That's why we are working hard. We have the recovery plan. We have also invested heavily in a winter plan for the NHS, which right now is funding the recruitment of extra NHS staff, is raising the pay of some social care workers, is heavily investing in trying to reduce delayed discharge. These are really serious issues that we treat extremely seriously.
Your government has already cast doubt on this data. And so I spoke to the Royal College of Emergency Medicine, and they said this: attempts have been made to discredit this data. However, patient base as well as patient care pathway in both Scotland and England are largely identical. It is therefore extremely likely that the associations between crowding and mortality are transferable to a Scottish context. We've had a discussion with one of the authors who absolutely agreed that the method is applicable to Scotland. So I say again, 300 people dying as a direct result.
For the avoidance of doubt, and if it sounded, I'm not trying to discredit the data, I was simply making a point, but it stands to reason, Andrew. We have waiting times targets, the 4-hour target in A&E, and you know, Scottish A&E units perform better than counterparts across the rest of the UK, but not good enough at the moment. So we have those targets for a reason, and therefore it stands to reason that if we're not meeting those targets, then patients are not getting the standard of care that they should be, which is why we are working so hard with the health service, with the extra investment and other initiatives to try to get those waiting times back to where we want them to be.
I'm asking you because you are in charge of all of this, and it's clearly not good enough. We've been trading statistics and so forth, but this is real people's lives.
I've not been trading statistics. I'm actually,
But a pensioner from Glasgow died after waiting 40 hours for an ambulance, and there was an 86-year-old woman in Edinburgh who had to wait 8 hours for an ambulance after falling and breaking her hip at home, no doubt in great agony. All across Scotland, there are some terrible stories, and the NHS is simply not working well enough.
Well, can I say, firstly, you put it to me that I'm in charge as if I was somehow denying that. I'm not. I'm in charge. I unreservedly accept the responsibility here. And my responsibility with my government is to address these challenges in the NHS in Scotland. These challenges have, in some cases, been created, in other cases, been hugely exacerbated by a global pandemic that we are still living through. These challenges in the NHS, which here in Scotland are my responsibility, are not unique to the NHS in Scotland. Right across the UK, Europe, the world, health services are facing these challenges. That is why we are...
It's also about resources inside the NHS. And in the 14 years of SNP administration, there are now 1,358 fewer emergency beds in Scotland than there were when you started. Why is that?
Well, bed numbers, acute bed numbers in the NHS in Scotland and the NHS in England, I think Wales and Northern Ireland, since long before the SNP was in government here, have been declining. The reason for that is changing patterns of care. So things like cataracts, hip, knee replacements. Previously, I remember my grandmother getting a cataract operation years and years ago, about 20 plus years ago. She was in hospital for days. Now you're in and out in the same day. So that's why we have seen that trend.
If you're waiting for care in Scotland, these comparisons don't really matter, do they? What matters is what happens to you.
Sure, but
and the Royal College of Emergency Medicine, who are the people who are experts in all of this, say that you need 1,000 extra beds in Scotland to start to change the backlog and reduce these terrible extra deaths.
I'm trying to engage with the issue and explain the trend, which again is not unique to Scotland. But where we are right now, I mentioned the NHS recovery plan, so we are targeting, with the investment we need, a significant increase both in inpatient and outpatient capacity in the NHS. The 1,000 beds, if you take that, we need to create that capacity in a number of ways. Genuine extra capacity is one of the ways. Reducing the number of people who are currently occupying hospital beds because of COVID. So there are over 700 hospital beds right now occupied by COVID patients, rightly and properly, because they need care. If we get COVID cases down, we free up that capacity. And there are over 1,000 people in hospital right now who don't need to be there. They are what we call delayed discharges, which is why currently we're investing in extra care home placements and extra care at home packages to get older people in particular care in the settings that is most appropriate for them, but then free up those hospital beds for those who need them. So this is really important work that we're doing. Governments everywhere are having to do this, and you're right to say it's my responsibility, which is why it's my focus each and every single day.
Harping yet again on those 300 extra deaths, that suggests this strategy just isn't working.
Well, no, it doesn't, Andrew. It suggests that there is a massive COVID-created or exacerbated problem in the NHS in Scotland, as there is in health services across the world, and we are taking the action to try to deal with that, to get our NHS through what will be an incredibly challenging winter, but into recovery and onto a sustainable footing. Is it good enough right now in Scotland and probably in any other country because of COVID? No. But the duty, the responsibility for leaders like me is to make sure we're doing what it takes to support the NHS through this.
Let's talk a bit more about the politics of all of this, because you have said that as soon as this epidemic crisis period is over, you will turn again to the question of independence. Therefore, does the arrival of the new variant delay things again?
I don't know the answer to that question right now, but what I do know, and I've said this all along, I was, elected 7 months ago during an election campaign where I made this very clear. For as long as necessary, steering and leading Scotland through this pandemic is my focus and my priority. Now, I made a statement in Parliament, as I do every week, on Tuesday, where I was really hopeful that we were starting to turn the corner. Cases are stable, slightly declining in Scotland right now. Clearly, a few days on, the situation potentially looks very different with the arrival of this new variant. So
you can't tell your party yet when you're going to have that referendum?
I think if I stood up in front of my party, as I will do tomorrow, and told them that I, alone in the world, could see when this COVID pandemic was going to end, then people would look at me a bit askance. I'm a politician, but I'm a politician that tries to be as straight as I can with people. People are entitled to judge the quality of those answers. We're in a global pandemic. It's still causing us serious challenges. I take my duties as First Minister very seriously. My primary duty right now is to lead the country through this pandemic and hopefully soon out of the other end of it.
Nicola Sturgeon, they can judge you, but thanks very much indeed for joining us today. Now, that's all from me from Glasgow. Thanks to all my guests and to you for watching. I will be back next week. Until then, goodbye.